For decades, millions of American workers believed their retirement was guaranteed by the government they served. But behind that promise, a silent financial crisis was already growing. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling hidden inside budgets, forecasts, and political decisions. A crisis that would take decades to fully reveal itself. By the time the warning signs became impossible to ignore, the gap had already reached trillions. And the people who trusted the system were the ones most at risk. For generations, public workers were offered a simple deal: serve your community, and your future would be secure. It was a promise backed not by markets, but by government guarantees. These were known as defined benefit pensions, designed to provide fixed income for life after retirement. The longer you served and the higher your salary, the larger your guaranteed payout. During the economic boom of the 1980s and 1990s, governments expanded these benefits with confidence. Strong markets made it seem like these promises would always be affordable. Cities and states increased benefits, often without increasing contributions to match future obligations. The gap between promises and funding quietly began to widen. In San Francisco, debates over pension expansions intensified during the early 2000s. Gavin Newsom would later become associated with decisions made during this period. At the same time, some experts warned that the system was built on overly optimistic assumptions. Among them was Richard Ravitch, who cautioned about long-term fiscal imbalance. Still, public unions strongly defended these benefits as fair compensation for years of service. For millions of workers, pensions were not a luxury, but a promise they depended on. Few questioned whether the system could withstand future economic downturns. The assumption was simple: markets would continue to grow, and governments would always pay. But beneath the surface, the math was becoming harder to ignore, and the first cracks were about to appear. The dot-com crash of the early 2000s sent shockwaves through pension fund investments. Assets that were expected to grow suddenly declined in value. Instead of increasing contributions, many governments chose to delay payments to ease short-term budget pressure. This decision would quietly deepen the crisis over time. Pension systems continued to assume annual returns of around 8%, but real market performance was far more unpredictable. This mismatch between expectations and reality created a growing funding gap. Liabilities increased faster than assets could keep up. Investor Warren Buffett warned that municipal finances were riskier than many believed. His concerns highlighted vulnerabilities in the system. Meanwhile, David Walker warned of long-term fiscal imbalance across the nation. But these warnings received limited political attention at the time. By the mid-2000s, the gap between pension promises and actual funding had grown significantly. But for most Americans, the problem remained invisible and largely misunderstood. Pension funds were increasingly relying on strong market returns to stay solvent. If those returns failed, the consequences would be severe. Yet, many policymakers chose to delay difficult decisions. Raising contributions or cutting benefits was politically unpopular. Instead, governments continued to push costs into the future, a strategy that would eventually magnify the financial strain. Some economists warned that the system was becoming unsustainable, but their concerns struggled to compete with short-term political priorities. At the same time, pension benefits continued to grow in certain regions. Enhancements were often approved during periods of economic optimism. This created a dangerous imbalance between what was promised and what was funded, a gap that would soon be tested by a major economic shock. Few anticipated just how severe that shock would be, and how quickly it would expose the system's weaknesses. The warning signs were there, but they were easy to ignore, until the global financial system itself began to collapse. The global financial crisis of 2008 would become the defining moment. It was the event that turned a hidden problem into a national emergency. Pension fund investments suffered massive losses almost overnight. Assets shrank while obligations remained unchanged. What had once been a manageable gap suddenly became a crisis, and cities across America were about to face impossible choices. By 2008, the financial crisis had spread across the United States with devastating speed. What began in housing markets quickly engulfed pension systems nationwide. Pension funds that depended on steady investment growth suddenly faced massive losses. The assumptions that once supported the system no longer held. The gap between assets and liabilities widened at an alarming rate, and governments were forced to confront a problem they had long delayed. Cities now faced difficult choices that would affect millions of lives. Raise taxes, cut public services, or reduce pension benefits. In many places, all three options carried political and social consequences. There was no easy solution, only trade-offs. The crisis became most visible in cities already struggling financially. Among them was Detroit, once a symbol of American industrial strength. Years of declining population and tax revenue had weakened the city's finances. Now pension obligations added even greater pressure. To manage the crisis, the state appointed Kevyn Orr as emergency manager. His task was to restructure a city on the brink of collapse. Orr concluded that Detroit's debts, including pensions, were unsustainable. Difficult decisions would have to be made. Meanwhile, other cities were facing similar challenges. In California, Stockton became one of the first major cities to declare bankruptcy. The city had expanded benefits during better economic times, but the downturn exposed how fragile its finances had become. On the East Coast, Central Falls, Rhode Island faced its own crisis. A small city overwhelmed by obligations it could no longer meet. Pensioners in Central Falls saw their benefits reduced significantly, a move that shocked many who believed their pensions were protected. The idea that pensions could be cut was once unthinkable. Now it was becoming a reality. In Chicago, Rahm Emanuel confronted rising pension costs. The city's financial future depended on difficult reforms. Efforts to address the crisis often met resistance from unions and workers. Each proposal carried consequences for both sides. In California, Arnold Schwarzenegger had earlier pushed for reforms, but lasting solutions proved difficult to implement. The crisis revealed how deeply pensions were tied to broader economic conditions. When markets fell, the entire system was affected. For retirees, the crisis was deeply personal. It threatened the security they had spent decades working toward. For taxpayers, it raised questions about fairness and responsibility. Who should bear the cost of promises made in the past? As the crisis deepened, the scale of the problem became clearer. It was no longer isolated to a few cities. It had become a nationwide issue with long-term consequences, and the worst was still yet to come. The next phase would push cities to their breaking point and redefine what pensions truly meant in America. What had once been a promise of stability was now a source of uncertainty, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Cities were running out of options, and time was no longer on their side. The next chapter would bring decisions that changed lives permanently and challenged the very foundation of public pensions. For many, the promise was already beginning to fade, and the reality was far more uncertain than expected. The stage was set for one of the largest municipal failures in history, a moment that would define the crisis. Detroit would soon become the center of national attention, and its bankruptcy would change everything. What followed would challenge long-held beliefs about pensions. and reveal the true cost of decades of promises. In 2013, Detroit officially filed for bankruptcy, marking a historic turning point. It became the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history. The Detroit Bankruptcy 2013 exposed the scale of pension underfunding. Billions in obligations could no longer be sustained. Emergency manager Kevyn Orr led the restructuring process. His decisions would directly impact thousands of retirees. For the first time, pensions were no longer considered untouchable. Cuts were proposed to help stabilize the city's finances. Retirees who had relied on these benefits faced a painful reality. Their guaranteed income was now uncertain. Michigan Governor Rick Snyder supported the restructuring efforts. The goal was to prevent complete financial collapse. Mediator Gerald Rosen helped negotiate a complex settlement. It became known as the Grand Bargain. The agreement combined public funds, private donations, and pension adjustments. It aimed to reduce cuts while preserving essential services. Even with the agreement, pensioners still faced reductions. The promise they trusted had been permanently altered. The Detroit case set a powerful precedent for other cities. It showed that pensions could be renegotiated under extreme conditions. Across the country, debates intensified over who should bear the cost. The issue became both economic and deeply political. In Wisconsin, Scott Walker pushed controversial reforms. They aimed to reduce pension burdens and limit union power. The reforms sparked massive protests and national attention. They highlighted the growing divide over public sector benefits. In California, Jerry Brown introduced changes to pension systems. New hires would receive reduced benefits compared to previous generations. These reforms signaled a shift in how pensions were structured. The era of guaranteed benefits was beginning to change. Estimates suggested pension shortfalls reached trillions of dollars nationwide. The exact number depended on assumptions about future returns. States like Illinois, New Jersey, and Connecticut faced particularly severe challenges. Their funding gaps were among the largest in the nation. Unlike sudden crashes, this crisis unfolded slowly over decades. A gradual squeeze rather than a single dramatic event. Today, many governments are shifting toward hybrid retirement systems, combining pensions with defined contribution plans. These changes aim to reduce long-term financial risk, but they also place more responsibility on individual workers. The debate continues over what is fair and sustainable. Balancing promises with financial reality remains a challenge. For retirees, the question is deeply personal. Will the benefits they earned still be there when needed? For younger workers, the future looks uncertain. The rules of retirement are changing before their eyes. For taxpayers, the burden may continue for years to come. The cost of past promises cannot be easily erased. The crisis has reshaped how governments approach long-term obligations and forced a reconsideration of what can realistically be promised. Yet, the core issue remains unresolved in many places. Funding gaps still exist and risks remain. The future of public pensions will depend on difficult choices. Choices that affect millions of lives across the country. The promise was never broken in a single moment. It faded slowly, shaped by years of decisions. What remains is a system still searching for balance between responsibility, fairness, and financial reality. The promise was not broken overnight, but it may not survive the future, and its legacy will shape generations to come.